Welcome, everyone. I'm excited to kick off this webinar, but first I want to mention some housekeeping items. You can put questions in the chat for a Q&A at the end, and this recording will be sent out early next week. I'm Sarah Wheeler. I'm editor-in-chief at HousingWire, and our topic today is decoding the modern appraisal. Of course, at this point, the phrase appraisal modernization is nothing new, but despite the topic's popularity, there are a lot of questions left unanswered. That's what this webinar is for, and we've got three experts to lead us through this conversation. So I'm going to introduce our panelists right now. We have Scott Rose, who's the Chief Innovation Officer at Class Valuation. We have Rachel Robinson, Director of Collateral Policy and Product Development at Rocket Mortgage. And we have Julie Giesbrecht, the Senior Policy Analyst at FHFA. Thank you guys all for joining us. I know this is going to be an amazing conversation. So let's get started. My first question is for you, Julie, and that's, what do we mean by appraisal modernization?
I think the best way to describe it is how FHFA has it listed in the scorecards for the enterprises. It's fostering accuracy, transparency, and efficiency in the appraisal process. Although now we don't even think about appraisal being the word. I always refer to it as single family collateral valuation, which is a mouthful, right? And we can't talk about modernization with really knowing the history of how we even got here. And so I've kind of been on a journey this last month, kind of digging into the archives to figure out, okay, what are the steps, what of the timeline? And I think what was interesting is I went back to 2017 when we were all having these conversations at the very beginning. FHFA hosted an appraisal workshop, like, hey, what are we doing here? What does this mean? Because we had just come off of August 2016, which was at that time the record high volume for loans. And that was the first time you saw that appraisers couldn't keep up with this extreme variable, loan volume. And so that was the question at the time, is what are we going to do? How can we modernize the process? And I would say, since 2018, modernization has been a chief goal for FHFA as exhibited in the scorecard goals, and it will be in 2024 as well.
I think it's great to lay that foundation that this is part of a process that's been going on for quite some time. It can feel like, it dovetailed with some of the other things going on in the industry, but actually this is a much larger and longer effort than maybe people realize. And then it just so happened that we had this pandemic that, kicked off this incredible boom that, then it kind of came, top of mind, because appraisal became such a pain point within the mortgage process. But, and now we're at a different place in the market. Well, let's talk about some of those new options. And Scott, I would like you to walk us through that. What are the new programs and solutions created as part of this modernization effort?
Sure. And I believe we'll throw a link in the chat for everybody. There's a great little visual on Fannie Mae's website that kind of helps to visualize this, articulate it, but really like to think about it in two spectrums. You have a valuation determination spectrum, which is where an appraiser is involved in the process. And you have a non-valuation determination where appraiser is not involved in the process, which most of us would think of today previously as only appraisal waivers. We've all been accustomed to those. We've used them for the past several years. There's another product in that sector today, which is an appraisal waiver with data collection. And what we've been able to do is expand that eligibility box a little bit by using data to support it, as well as really layering it in on top of certain waivers that were eligible previously. So the data and waiver programs kind of covers both spectrums, where we're going back on historically what would have only been a waiver and adding data collection. And then we're also able to bring more properties into that waiver eligibility box by using data collection. A great example of that might be a property that everything looks great for a waiver, but maybe recently there was a natural disaster that came through the area. Let's just get eyes on the property, make sure it's okay, that there's no damage and anything potentially risky from a collateral perspective. Really helps to support and streamline processes utilizing that solution. Second to that, we have the valuation determination process, which is historically where our traditional appraisal sat. That would include everything from full interior, exterior appraisals or exterior only appraisals, different tools we've used over the last couple of decades to support collateral process. Now we've layered in two more products in that spectrum, one being the desktop appraisal, which rolled out God, bear with me, guys. Time goes by so fast now. I think it's been over a year now. It was early in 2022, I believe. Yes, thank you, Julie, Rachel. When desktop went to policy, and we'll talk more about adoption further in the webinar, but that product allows for data to be utilized on purchase transaction, eligible purchase transactions, so the appraiser can complete a report without actually having to visit the property. There's certain required criteria, like a floor plan with interior walls to support the layout of the property, front rear street of the subject property, and images of all the major rooms in the home, and also enough data and information that the appraiser feels confident that they can derive a credible result. And we also have hybrid appraisals, which is where we use the same data collection that we use to support the data and waiver programs to go out and collect data using a third party, and then provide that information to an appraiser to complete that report. One important area to note is that product is only eligible in policy today for property data and waiver products that need to go to hybrid. There are varying reasons for that. Fannie Mae, mostly related to the credit file. If something changes in that changes the eligibility. Freddie does have certain property characteristics that might require you to upgrade to hybrid, but it is very few and far between where you actually do need to move to hybrid from those programs. And they've also been used in test and learn, where we proactively go directly to a hybrid, go out and collect that data and provide it to an appraiser to perform their analysis. What we saw during the boom time in 2022 in test and learn is a lot of benefit from those solutions when the market does get to be extremely busy. And we can talk more about that later as well.
So, we have more options now. It's a little bit more confusing. I mean, it could be confusing on the front end, but like so much more specialization on what we need for that property. So it's not a one size fits all or a three size fits all, right? We've got these different options now that people can really utilize. And so I'd love to ask you, Rachel, how are lenders looking at these different options and utilizing them?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think you framed it nicely. The more choices you bring into the market, the more difficult it gets to understand. What we've learned over the years, I mean, we started down this path sort of exploring what the hybrid appraisal could offer. And we were trying to solve for volume issues and this depleting appraiser group of folks. And what do we do if we need to be able to pull some levers and handle another high volume type market like that. And in doing so, I think we learned some interesting information that, like most things in lending, valuation sort of has a risk spectrum, a waterfall approach that tends to be helpful to have multiple tools in the toolbox. So while it is a little confusing and can be overwhelming for folks to think about in terms of adoption, what we've done at Rocket is sort of put things into three buckets, right? You've got properties that need just waivers. We're all super familiar with those. You've got properties that need some sort of valuation. So whether it be traditional or hybrid, it's a property that needs valuation. Or you have a waiver that is paired with a data collection, or what we call an inspection-based waiver at Rocket. So the property is going to fall in one of those three buckets when we're talking about, GSE agency type loans. And what we've seen is that folks who are getting these inspection-based waivers really like them. It's been very popular among the broker community, realtors, real estate agents, and clients. Really, I mean, hey, if you can get certainty on your value very quickly, up front what we're going to be dealing with in terms of value. And then you're just getting a data collection to make sure, as Scott mentioned, there's nothing wildly wrong with your property, which in most cases it's not. And you can ask really good questions up front to help make sure that that eligibility piece is met. Then you end up getting the equivalent of what we're all used to as an appraisal waiver. It's much less expensive than a traditional appraisal, takes way less time. And I think this is really a neat sort of experience to be able to have those options open up to a larger swath of folks that maybe weren't getting access to appraisal waivers before. So pretty exciting.
That is exciting. And Julie, I'd like to ask you, there is this larger question about adoption. So Rachel talked about what Rocket is doing. We know in the past, some of the options haven't had a lot of uptick, right, in adoption for various reasons. When you look at now all of these options, what are we seeing? What are you guys seeing as far as adoption?
That's dependent on the day in the market. Right now, in terms of adoption, traditional appraisals are beating us all, right? Is we're looking at like 85% of the share right now is traditional appraisals. We see more adoption of the alternative products when volume is high, turn times are extended, and fees are higher. Appraisal waivers, highly dependent on refinance transactions. Last year we saw much higher volume. Now we're sitting at, 13, 14%. Appraisal waivers with inspections or property data, much lower adoption. But, let's see, Freddie came out in July. I'm checking my knowledge here, July of 2022. And then Fannie was April of 2023. So these are still relatively new outside of the pilot space, right? Desktops, Scott, I know you want to talk about desktops. Desktops served us very well during the pandemic. But when we brought them to policy in 2022, the exhibit requirements were much more stringent. Scott, you mentioned the floor plan requirement and some of the photo requirements. That was different than what we saw during the pandemic. And so we do see much lower adoption of desktop appraisals. And so I think the big question for me and FHFA is, how do these fit in the future? And I'd love to have some discussion around that. And then finally, around hybrids, the biggest portion of hybrid volume, as Scott and Rachel mentioned, is still in the pilot program. They've been in pilot since 2018, and that's a really robust pilot if you think about it. We've been able to explore hybrids in almost every type of environment now. We've gone through a pandemic, we've gone through low volume, we've gone through high volume. And so the big question now is, how do we move these to the market? What is their place in comparison to traditional appraisals and some of these other products? And, what are the levers to pull? Is it full adoption, or do they sit in a more narrow risk bucket?
Love that. And Scott, I would love to have you jump in here and talk about what you see as far as adoption.
Absolutely. I mean, I'll start with desktop. I think that it has had a slower rate of adoption as it came out of the gate, but part of that is related to those exhibits Julie was talking about, where the majority of the listings around the country today don't have that information readily available for it to be leveraged in that fashion. However, the opportunity for this product as we continue to go forward is big in many different ways from my perspective. One is, as real estate agents, which they are starting to learn more about, utilize these technologies at point of list to collect that information at that time, then the data is readily available to support the appraisal process at time of purchase. And when the market picks up, we all remember 2020, 2021, 2016, where people were waiting weeks for appraisals, holding up purchase transactions, fees were going through the roof. It was really a poor experience for all constituents in the appraisal process, which isn't good for appraisers either, because then people continue to look for other solutions as well. This is a great tool to keep the appraiser involved in the transaction, and also to start to collect more comprehensive data at point of list that can then be utilized downstream in the comparable pool as well for appraisers to use and have a lot more information and data on the properties they're using in their analysis. So I think it actually has some of the biggest opportunity for adoption as we continue to go forward, as the market adapts and adjusts to these opportunities. Secondly, the IBWs, the inspection-based waivers, those are no-brainers for folks in the process. It's the next best thing to a waiver for an originator. They're low cost, they're fast, so it does reduce the cost of the consumer. And these are typically in very low risk scenarios where an appraisal, quite frankly, is overkill and not necessary. So it's a great tool to reduce costs for the consumer, to increase the speed and the efficiency of the overall process. And then last, on hybrid, again, hybrid's not in full policy today, so that limits adoption, and we have to recognize that. It can only be used in test and learn. There were all kinds of benefits for hybrid in all the test and learns we've done across the board at every data point that you look at. And again, it forces the use of technologies to create more transparency, more consistency. It's repeatable, and it's source of truth data about the properties themselves. So a lot of opportunity to leverage those as they do move to policy, and we continue to advance.
I like how you outlined, which ones are being picked up now and why. I'd love to dive in a little bit about what results we're seeing. Okay, so and I keep calling it appraisal modernization, and I know that like valuation, right? These valuation options is probably how I should be talking about that. But what do we see as far as like, what are the results so far? And Rachel, I'd like to go to you. What is Rocket seeing?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. In places where there is enough order volume to really support the market, there's not a lot of lender players in the space yet. So it's kind of driven by the lenders that have joined into adopting these products and having higher volumes to be able to support these networks of data collectors, and the appraisers that are choosing to do that type of workflow works better for a lot of folks' schedules for a number of reasons. And I'm sure Scott can talk a little bit more about that later. But where we would really love to see some of this helping would be in areas where we struggle finding enough appraisers. So these are areas that tend to be a little bit more rural and tend to just have a lower volume component, which means you need everyone to sort of come together to create the support to be able to really fully support a network of what could be really helpful in these communities. When we do have good volume, we see amazing turn times. A lot of times these data collections are coming back in 24 to 48 hours. If you don't need a valuation, you're done. You're done in 48 hours. You're all clear on the property. That's really exciting when you weren't given, a straight up waiver up front. Even when you're using a hybrid, you get that data collection back in 48 hours. A lot of these appraisers can turn these valuations in 24 hours. So, you're looking at, depending on if you've got a weekend in there, 3 to 5 days to get these valuations back. That's really exciting. And so I think everybody, particularly in a purchase transaction, really just wants to know, hey, are we gonna run into issues on the property, right? The sooner you can figure that out and either breathe the sigh of relief because you're all clear, or know what you have to deal with early on before people have moving trucks rented and life's getting really chaotic. Just makes everybody's life easier. So we also see lower correction or revision or addendum rates on these types of products, because as Scott mentioned, we're using technology to collect all of the data around them. So the chances that you're going to have to make a correction or revisit are slim to none. High quality ratings, high CU scores, like all the things you want to see to show that these are really quality products, we've had really great results on.
Thanks for that. And Julie, I would ask you what you see as far as what kind of results are you seeing at your level?
Well, that's the funny thing, is the results that I see are what lenders and vendors and the enterprises report as part of their scorecard deliverable. So much of the same that Rachel and Scott are seeing.
Nice. Scott, I'd love for you to jump in here and just talk about, when you think about results, what are the results for appraisers, right? So this isn't just a benefit for lenders or consumers that, before we started, we were talking about how this can keep them busy and, can kind of some of the benefits it provides for appraisers themselves.
Absolutely. And it's kind of funny because I believe that sometimes the narrative is that a lot of appraisers don't like these products. I get phone calls regularly from appraisers around the country who are asking for this work, who would love to stay at their desk and be able to perform, work all day without having to go out into the field and do the data collection and visit the properties. To Rachel's point, it's hard to get enough volume to keep them busy all day long, that many appraisers, until more and more adoption does come to fruition. We do have certain areas around the country where we've opened markets, and we're starting to see that kind of volume where appraisers can stay busy. And quite frankly, they earn more money with their time than they do in the traditional process. So it's a earning potential for appraisers for sure. There's a lot of efficiencies built into the system from that perspective. And as I mentioned, as an appraiser, I look forward to the time when these tools are utilized on a more regular basis, and we start to improve the data pool of the comparables and the information out there around the market that we're assessing, because it's becoming more standard, more repeatable, more comprehensive, more transparent, which will really support more credible outcomes downstream. So I think that's also a great opportunity. I mean, like it or not, today, if you look at the MLS, if you look at public record, you look at appraisal data, it's very inconsistent in terms of how properties are reported. And with these technologies that we bring to the process, it's creating consistency and repeatability. Now we can send 5 people out to the property and get the same 5 results each time, which really improves the data pool in terms of accuracy on the information.
So this really, that was a great segue to my next question, which is really, how do these new approaches help battle appraisal bias? We know that's been something that has been a big topic over the last year, and talking about standardization, talking about getting to those kind of things. Scott, maybe tell us about how the new tools and processes can lead to more objectivity and valuation.
For sure. So starting with the data collection solutions, again, it's repeatable, it's transparent, it's comprehensive, and it really takes out any sort of subjectivity from the process of collecting information at the property. I know, through the Brookings Institute and the Oshuka, challenge for valuing homes in Black communities, that was one thing where these technologies, our technology at Class was awarded the Spotlight Innovator, and it was related to that. It was related to how comprehensive the information is, the full transparency, the 3D models, and the repeatability of the technology itself to bring that. And now you have appraisers basing their opinions off the data being provided to them versus the data they're providing to us, which also helps the appraiser to be able to have that level of transparency. I know when I've talked to folks like John Dingman, our chief appraiser, if he were in the field, he would be using these technologies in his own practice to provide that level of transparency, just to mitigate any potential downstream concerns. Secondly, there are other technologies. We haven't talked about a lot of them today, but there are technologies coming in at a more regular basis right now to support the development of the appraisal process as well, using analytics and data to support the outcome. And I really think, as even just as recently of doing my continuing education to renew my appraisal license this year, and I'm taking the fair lending course and the USPAP update where it's talking about appraisal bias at length. It's really about being as objective as possible and using data and facts to support your conclusions and not swaying to any sort of subjective terms. And there are technologies and tools out there now that can really support the appraiser in that process. And so we're leaning into those. I think many appraisers are leaning into those tools, and that's really something that will help to mitigate bias as we go forward.
So Julie, I'd love for you to weigh in here as well from your perspective.
Sure. I think, once you introduce more data, and transparency to the process, there's no turning back. And so anytime you have more transparency, especially into the property characteristics of the subject and market characteristics as well, that has a wonderful potential of reducing the potential for bias. Previously the enterprises were very much focused on overvaluation from a safety and soundness perspective. And of course, that's still top priority. And so you saw that reflected in their risk tools like Collateral Underwriter and Loan Collateral Advisor. But then more recently, they've introduced undervaluation flags into those models as well, just to give lenders the tools to be able to identify those risks and ensure that consumers are being treated fairly, and that the appraisals are accurate and based on property and market characteristics, and not the people that live in those homes in those neighborhoods. I think, and we're not here to talk necessarily about UAD and forms redesign, but I think it's certainly something to remind people of is that's upcoming in limited production in 2025. It is fast approaching. It seems like it's far away, but it's not. A lot of the education and development is in the process for 2024, and it will be here before you know it. And really the intent of that project is to standardize more appraisal data, to reduce the potential for any subjectivity, and to really reduce open commentary, and really just kind of drill down in this particular section of the appraisal. What is the appraiser describing here? What is the analysis as it relates to this particular area of the appraisal? And so, I look forward to seeing what more standardized appraisal data will help with, especially in some of our underserved markets.
So we've already had, if we talk about the appraisal subcommittee for just a minute here. So we've already had 3 hearings already on appraisal bias. There's a 4th in February. What are the goals of that of those hearings? And maybe talk about also some of the takeaways.
Sure. We started out in the hearing working group and planning for these hearings and just trying to figure out, okay, what are we trying to do here? And the first was just identify what the problem is. What are the root causes? Rip apart that regulatory system and how everybody fits into it, how it impacts consumers, how it impacts appraisers, the states that are trying to enforce on appraisers, and then really just kind of delve into the appraisal subcommittee's enforcement authority to impact change here. In the first 3 hearings, we've really seen from almost every stakeholder group. You've heard from lenders, you've heard from appraisers, you heard from the consumers that were actually impacted by a bias case. And I look forward to the 4th hearing. A lot of the feedback that we got was that, folks wanted to hear more of the quote boots on the ground appraiser perspective. And while we've had appraisers as witnesses in previous hearings, I think that they really wanted someone who is just out there appraising. And so I hope to see that in the 4th hearing in February. OCC is spearheading that. The date is 2/13. So mark your calendar, save the dates, and witness announcements will be going out soon. But I think for me, one of the takeaways that was also promoted by the PAVE action plan is we really needed to take a look into the reconsideration of value process. Previously, the enterprises didn't have a policy on reconsideration of value. They had a policy on multiple appraisals or a subsequent appraisal when the first one couldn't be resolved, like deficiencies couldn't be resolved in that appraisal, but no reconsideration of value policy. And so HUD, the enterprises, and FHFA have been working together since that first hearing to drive some consistent policies. And I think we can all signal and wait to hear that we're going to have some policies here soon, fingers crossed. And I think another great outcome that we've already started to see from these hearings is some improved collaboration between the appraisal subcommittee and the appraisal foundation, particularly, the board of trustees and what that structure looks like, the appraisal standards board, and then the appraiser qualification board as well. So we saw, updates to USPAP, hot off the press. And then, back over the summer, we saw some updates to the appraiser qualification criteria. So I think there's more to come. I like that we're kind of scratching the surface, and it has really let me know that there's a lot of work to do in 2024 and beyond.
Well, great segue to our next part, which is really talking about what it looks like, what's ahead for appraisal modernization, what we can look to as far as like evolving solutions and how we get more adoption. And so, let's go back to you, Scott, and maybe you can be the first one to answer that as far as like what's ahead for appraisal modernization.
Well, I think, continuing to lean into these property data collection solutions, I think that's pretty much something that's here to stay at this point. And we've proven it out. We've done the testing. The results are there. There's some questions in the chat, and I know we'll get to that, and we can talk about the reliability and the accuracy of the data collection using these tools. And then obviously, I think there's the potential that hybrid will become policy. That's still unknown, but outside of the data collection process. And I think we will start to see more market participants adopting these solutions to support their processes with more efficiencies, being real estate agents and others as they learn more and more about these solutions. And we kind of move away from some of the misconceptions out there and start focusing on the real results. They're going to start to adopt these tools in the process. Secondly to that, I think the next phase, where are we going from here? My guess is we're going to start to see the use of technology in the appraisal process itself, in the development, the analysis, and the reporting. And there's a lot of great technology to support that's available now. And this is all about moving with the modernization of technology that's in our world today. As scary as it can be, there's a lot of tools out there that can be used to really bring more credibility to our process. So I think that's the next step of where we'll go.
If I can piggyback off of that, Scott, I think, we have seen in all of the lending experience, the appraisal sort of being the limiting factor in a purchase transaction of everybody having this level of comfort and certainty around where the transaction is going to end up. And leveraging what we can do with modernization, I think really changes the dynamic of how we can think about completing a valuation on a home, because we're introducing technology that sort of becomes agnostic to the person that is collecting the information on the home. So I think down the line, we're going to really see folks starting to understand and unlock the power of this technology and the ability to collect data anytime we would like to collect data on a home. So we start moving away from, the beginning point of like, now there's an offer on a home, and moving up to earlier in the process as we're thinking about putting our home on the market, starting to collect that data earlier and earlier on, so that if it turns out you do need a valuation and you very much are dependent upon an appraiser to complete that part of the transaction, all of that information being readily available before you've even identified a borrower on the home really gets us to an interesting and exciting place. I think that, a lot of different parties in the transaction should get excited about, but we've got to keep exploring what we're doing now, like anything that's new, to make sure that we've got enough, data behind us to be able to say, okay, this is actually a really great and safe way to go around accurately collecting the data on the property.
I think we see a lot of questions in the chat, and just in general, people have a lot of questions about that data collection, or maybe the data collectors is what I should say. So piggybacking off of what you just said, Rachel, Scott, do you want to dive in a little bit there about how you see data collecting with this technology and what that looks like?
Yeah, I think a couple things that are really important to note. First of all, and this may not be the same for all solutions, but pretty much getting there to this point, most everybody out there that is performing these solutions does have technology embedded in the process. The technology becomes the independence. You cannot dupe these technologies. They are totally transparent. There are thousands of images taken that are stitched together to create 3D models. We know where any room was missed and not captured. We know where conduit runs up inside of a house, where there's void spaces. It's completely transparent and non-manipulable. So really we get to the point where it won't matter who is behind the technology collecting that property data, even to a point where at some time homeowners themselves could go through and collect the data for the property, and we would know we had all the information necessary to complete reliable results. And so we really take the potential of the individual out capturing the information from influencing that information. And the technology does that today. I want to make that clear. That's what's so exciting about these tools. That's why there's recognition for these tools in the bias programs, because it really helps to control that. We also know, second to that I'll point out, we've done hundreds of thousands of these to this point over the years that, were just talked about early on as we opened up this session. The data collection is more consistent and often more reliable than what we saw from all the years of data collected through UCDP with what appraisers were submitting. So as an appraiser, as much as I hate to hear that, humans naturally have error rates. And so there's inconsistencies that come through in that process, where putting technology in the process really helps to mitigate that. And that's a fact on hundreds of thousands of transactions. The property data being collected is highly accurate, it's highly comprehensive, and it's very repeatable.
Julie, I'd love to go to you with this question, which is, I feel like in the valuation modernization, that's definitely part of it, but it's part of an overall government really look to standardize data across the mortgage transaction, so that we can compare apples to oranges, not just on valuation, but on a lot of other things. What would you add to what Scott said about how technology is helping that?
I think technology, and this actually goes back to your last question too about the future, is we've well covered property data collection. And, I think anybody can go to the enterprise selling guides and look at the requirements for those property data collectors as well, because I know that's been a big question. But to Scott's point, the technology is driving from a quality perspective here. The property data requirements are a lot more robust and comprehensive. And to take it even a step further, the enterprises announced in August that they have a uniform property data set, so it makes it even easier for lenders and also for the folks collecting that data to adopt, a uniform data standard. And it is more robust than what we're seeing in appraisals now. But when we think about the future of UAD, that's where this comes into play, is that we are going to see more standardization. And from an appraiser perspective, I'm an appraiser too. I think that's ultimately going to make things easier for appraisers. But, from the appraiser perspective as well, I think we're going to have to start seeing more technology adoption from appraisers. I think we're going to have to adapt to, various processes. And, I would say, appraisal waivers and appraisal waivers with property data collection and hybrids, they're all great options. But the fact is that appraisers are still very much needed. We've been very clear about that. And we just want to ensure that the quality of the appraisals that we get is accurate. And any appraiser out there, and I'm looking at the chat now, will tell you that appraisals fuel some of these alternatives as well. And so that's why it's also really important that the integrity of the appraisal data is at the highest standard.
Rachel, what do you? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Scott.
Sorry, Sarah. And I was just going to say, I have to say, I think UAD2 is a huge opportunity as well. It will help appraisers also when the data's confined to specific areas within the report. So if there's information that was in an addendum and an appraiser got a request for a correction, but they're like, it was in my addendum, but these addendums are long and not always is that information readily available. This is going to streamline that process. Underwriters are going to know where to go. It's going to be more easily able to capture that information. So I do think that's going to be a big benefit for our profession as well. Sorry, Sarah.
No, that's great. I was just going to ask Rachel what she's excited about when she looks at this, the future appraisal modernization options. What do you get excited about when you look at that?
Well, I know this is going to be a bit of sort of repeating some of the points we've hit on, but I think it is really imperative that we move continually into a space where things are subjective and scientific. I'm sorry, objective and scientific, not subjective. And, I think humans have the best of intent. We always do, but we're humans. And so it's difficult to see consistency when there's a wide array of how you can interpret or measure a property. The things that should be very standard about how we think about a home are still not there yet, which blows my mind in 2023, right? And I think a lot of the reason that we haven't moved as quickly as we could into a place that seems very logical is because, there's fear. And this happens in every type of environment or space where you're seeing technology enter the chat and, people get a little bit uncomfortable. Like, what does that mean? Does that mean my job's going to get eliminated? And it's so interesting because what ends up happening is that we bring in technology where it makes sense. And we really help that to empower the humans to do what they do best. Julie just said it. We're not talking about getting rid of appraisers. Like, there are too many unique property types out there that we really need skilled appraisers to help us understand what's going on with those types of homes. New things are entering every day, cloud condominiums and barn dominiums and horizontal property regimes and things that hit my desk every day that I'm like, what is this? I need humans to help us get in there and understand it. We need humans to help us continue to collect the information, skilled, licensed humans to help us collect the information we need to be able to offer some of these alternatives where it's not needed, right? Like, this happens all across the world in so many different types of examples where we use technology and data science to make decisions where it's good at it. And then we use humans where we need humans. And so I'm excited as we continue to adopt and understand and embrace this type of world, what that is going to unlock, particularly for the consumer. That is a really great world for the consumer to live in. And I think every single one of us here, we are all here to operate for what's in the consumer's best interest.
I think that becomes even more interesting. Like right now, it's been a slower year, obviously volume wise. So some of the pain points over the last 3 years have changed or abated altogether. But I think about just last week, the fact that we had a pretty dramatic drop in mortgage rates. We're seeing a whole different kind of spring than what we've done before. It's so hard to predict what's going to happen next in the market, that at least these options and being prepared for that, whatever that is that's coming, seems to me the best way to go forward for everyone involved in the process, including appraisers who, I don't know how they had a life during 2020 and 2021, and just the pressure on them. I'd love to get to some of the questions now. So the first one I'm going to ask, and I'm not sure who's the best one to answer this, but it's in the purchase space. Will we see less straight waiver value acceptance and more value acceptance and property data collection? Like, is that the expectation?
I'll take some of it here. I think appraisal waivers with property data open up the universe of appraisal waivers to borrowers and to properties where there's a question mark of quality, question mark of condition. I think Scott, at the top of the hour, you talked about, a natural disaster came through. So, and I saw another question here that maybe kind of ties into is, what even qualifies for a waiver? And I think it's really important that, you understand the lender, in their automated underwriting system will enter an estimated value, and that's going to be for a refi. For a purchase transaction, it's going to be for the sales price. And, they enter that, and wherever it goes, Fannie or Freddie, they run, the data. And if the value is okay, then that's, or within, risks and tolerances and their box that they've set forth, then it would be eligible for the waiver. But property data solutions expand that. So it checks all of these eligibility boxes, but there's an unknown as it relates to the property itself. So I think we can expect to see more of that, just because there were so many properties that would have qualified if there wasn't the question mark about the subject itself.
I like it. Scott, Rachel, anyone want to jump in on that?
Go ahead, Rachel. I think Julie did a great job.
Yeah, I was
framing
going to say
so.
what Julie said.
Yeah.
No, that's great. So here's the question, and I'm not sure I understand this question. So you guys might, where it's, can we touch on how the future of collateral underwriter is the future of valuation? The PDR seem a bit redundant with the amount of data that could be available in CU, or is the PDR required because of a lack of data from CU? Does that, it's a lot of acronyms there. So,
I think I understand what's being asked here, and I think maybe let's split it out, because I think a lot of folks have a misunderstanding of what CU and LCA are. They're risk tools. And so, appraisal data comes in from UCDP, and just think of these as like dashboards for lenders, where, it aggregates that appraisal data and it gives you flags and messages. So they're really lender tools. And so CU doesn't do anything in terms of, qualifying you for a waiver or any, it's a secondary market tool to assist lenders. And Rachel, I see you nodding your head a lot. And so you maybe want to tell, how Rocket uses CU and LCA.
Yeah, I think you did really great making that distinction, because the way I think about a data collection being different from CU or LCA and not necessarily being redundant is that the data going in is what CU and LCA are evaluating. What the data collection does is it standardizes that data. It's standardized in two ways. Number one, it is a specific standardized data set that is now saying, this is exactly what you're going to be collecting on every single property. And it is supported by a technology that is calibrated to make sure that the way we are consuming and providing that data is also standardized. So the data collection enhances CU's ability and LCA's ability to run a proper risk profile. It's like any computer system, garbage in, garbage out, right? And so, today you could have a traditional appraisal and the data that's collected on there may be perfect. It also might not be, but all of that is what's going in to CU and LCA. And what makes it tricky is that on the traditional appraisal, we are using a professional standard of USPAP to be able to guide how we go about collecting that data, which is great. It is definitely a framework. It's just not as specific as a standardized data set. So that's how I would say they differ. And the way I think about it from a lender's perspective, Scott, I don't know if you have a different take.
No, not different at all. The only piece I would layer in is thinking of, the U.S. housing stock as being very organic, right? It's constantly changing, evolving, updating, going through, natural disasters, wear and tear, who knows, right? And so property data collection is a great way to keep the freshness of that information up to date. And you need to continue to understand properties as they evolve to have that level of information. If too much time goes by, then you lose sight of what the property really looks like today. And so it brings us up to date of real-time information.
I love that. Here's another question that I think speaks to a larger question in the chat, which is, how exactly does a lender determine a value on the residence in order to receive an appraisal waiver? So I think there's some questions about that. Not sure who wants to take that.
Yeah, I can take that. Julie did a good job distinguishing sort of the difference between a refi and a purchase. So in the case of a purchase, we all have a contract price that we're agreeing upon. And so that's what's submitted to the GSEs. It gets a little bit trickier with a refi because you're having a conversation with the client, with the borrower, to understand, what we believe the estimated value of the property is. And some folks are very attuned to what's going on in the market, and some folks have no idea. And so often lenders will use tools like AVMs or their own internal sort of estimating engines to be able to have a little bit of a more informative conversation. Maybe they might have tools internally to look at different comparables that might be sold recently in the area to help have a dialogue with the consumer to say, hey, this is what we're seeing in your area. Does this ring true to you? Does this sound like your home? Does your home feel like it's in similar condition? If so, this is what we estimate the value to be. And then that's what's going to be submitted into the GSCs. It's not a perfect science by any stretch of the imagination, but I think there's a lot of framework that goes into making sure that we're at least, getting in the right range of where we believe that house to be worth.
Anything you would add there, Scott?
Nope. I think Rachel understands it a lot more from her perspective anyhow. So that's great.
Awesome. I think there's quite a few questions about the idea of and I know the data collectors have had questions and how those relate to appraisers, how those things are both being communicated, and the fact that anytime you have a human involved, as you guys said, there are things that can happen. What do you guys see as far as the way that Scott, you said, some of the tools make it much harder to have some of that, subjectivity come into it just by the way that they are set up. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. I think one of the easy way or the best ways to maybe articulate this is the technology we're using to capture data and information about a property now is the same technology that is driving self-propelled vehicles. It's very advanced. It uses image recognition, it uses photogrammetry, it uses LiDAR. The LiDAR that's now embedded in the, regular everyday iPhones are tools we use to get highly accurate measurement information that's more than any the best human with a tape measure or a laser device could possibly get. And it's broader, it's more comprehensive. It's not just a two-dimensional exterior layout of the property. We're getting detailed information about the layout of that home with a floor plan and three-dimensional understanding of the property. So, you know, as it relates to the quality of construction, 8-foot ceilings, 10-foot ceilings, open 2-story ceilings, floor to ceiling windows. There's a lot of information that the data is able to capture and bring back in that information set where views are visible from, as a great example, right? So now I know if there's an ocean view and that's tagged spatially within the context of the data, that I have a great room with 2-story ceilings, floor to ceiling windows, and an ocean view. Well, that's a lot more information than saying I have an open ocean view, but you have to press your head up against a window to look at slightly to get that. It's not as powerful, right? So the information is becoming more comprehensive. It's more repeatable and it's more accurate from that. We get inventory of the flooring. We get fixture inventory that you can get your make, model, match of all the major appliances in the home. So you know how dated everything is within the property. It's just more comprehensive and it's more consistent.
Love that. So I have one last question here, and then we will be wrapping up. And it is, I am of the understanding that a property data report, whether PDC or PDR, does not get submitted to CU or LCA. Is that changing? Again, kind of in the weeds there. Anybody want to jump in?
A little bit in the weeds, but I see the eyes on me.
You feel
obviously we're collecting the data, right? And I think this ties into some of the other questions that I see in the chat too, is, you know, how are we verifying the quality of that data? And so I think, you know, it's helpful for the audience to know that the enterprises do have a robust review process as it relates to property data, just as the same as they do for appraisals. And then on top of that, anytime there's property data collected and it's used in conjunction with a hybrid appraisal, that appraiser has all the right in the world to review that data, validate, verify, and if that information is inaccurate, they can use their own data. So the appraiser has options there. Now, as it relates to will the enterprises use data in their tools? I think that's pretty obvious that they would. Why collect the data if we're not going to use the data? So obviously, I think that's part of the roadmap of what we would see in the future.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much. I appreciate it. I know we didn't get to all the questions. Our panelists do have those questions. They can reach out. And I would say that, you know, this recording will be sent out early next week. If you want to listen to part that you missed or send it out to someone else, I want to thank our audience and thank you so much to our panelists. I appreciate you guys coming on and talking about this really important topic.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks for having us.